So I want to introduce Julie Langan, I hope I said that right, who serves as the director of the Department of Historic Resources and is the State Historic Preservation Officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are really honored that you took time out of your schedule to be with us tonight, Julie. She was first appointed as acting director by Governor McDonnell. She has been reappointed by Governors McAuliffe, Northern, and Youngkin. In this position, Langan manages one of the largest state preservation offices in the country and oversees a dozen state and federal preservation projects. She has twice been on the staff of the Department of Historic Resources for a combined total of 25 years. Immediately prior to her appointment, she served as the department's Deputy Director for Preservation Programs, an experienced preservation professional and nonprofit administrator. She has held leadership positions with regional and local preservation nonprofits in Cleveland, Ohio, and taught historic preservation at Virginia Commonwealth University and the University of Mary Washington. Over the years, she has served on a variety of preservation boards and commissions. Ms. Langan has an MA in architectural history from the University of Virginia and a BA in art history from Wheaton College in Massachusetts. Julie, thank you for being with us. We've been looking forward to this.
As have I. Thank you, Fran, very much for the invitation to talk about one of my very favorite subjects. And before I launch in, I want to say hello to a couple of friends who I see are participating virtually. Our board chair, chair of the Board of Historic Resources, Tucker Lemon from Roanoke, hello. And then, of course, my colleague who works in our Salem office, Tom Klatka. So thanks for joining, and hello to both of you. I think that the Warm Springs pools provide a really excellent case study of how a community can advocate for a threatened property. And I admittedly could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to just hit the highlights and then hope that you will ask questions at the end. If we were all together and meeting in person, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've ever taken the waters. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a very therapeutic experience. I'm going to talk about a over 12-year effort to save this complex of historic resources. And I'm leading off by showing you some of the photographs that I took just last month. And I'm eager to go back in the spring and take them when it's not muddy and the new plantings have started to flourish. But the buildings themselves are just looking better than they have in decades. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight, their decline and their renaissance. And if you haven't actually been to the pools, here are just a few more views of them taken last month. There's a complex of buildings, 3 buildings and a spring house, and a couple of nice historic signs. And I happened to take these on a day that was pretty wintry weather. So on the lower left side, you can see around that Warm Springs pool sign, lots of ice covering the trees. If you're not familiar with the pools, I think the logical place to start is to explain why they're so important. Why would so many people rally behind them and feel that we had a crisis that needed to be addressed? They're phenomenally significant. And not just because they're listed in the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places, but more importantly, because they are a stunningly rare example of resources associated with once flourishing mineral spring resorts. And if you think about where this is located in the village of Warm Springs in the county of Bath, which is near Healing Springs and Hot Springs, there was this huge mineral springs industry in Bath County, as well as other Virginia counties, that attracted visitors, not just from Virginia, but from all the surrounding states. So I would argue that this complex is nationally significant and that it's been attracting visitors for hundreds and thousands of years. And to try to prove that, I sent out our prior state archaeologist, Mike Barber, to look for evidence of Native American visitation. And because of the issue of recurrent flooding, the entire landscape has been scoured numerous times. So there wasn't that evidence, but we know it's only logical that indigenous populations would have known of and enjoyed these springs. And just to summarize the date of construction of the buildings that we're talking about, the men's bathhouse was built in the 1830s, followed by the ladies in 1875. And what's called the reception house, which is the charming little cottage, came later during the Victorian period. And the image on the lower right-hand side shows you the village of Warm Springs when there was still the Warm Springs Hotel built behind the spring complex. And this was a very large hotel that attracted many, many guests, but unfortunately burned in the 1950s. And just an aerial view showing you the orientation of these four structures. On the right, you have the men's bathhouse. On the left, the women's. Above it, the guest, the little cottage. And then the smallest of those buildings is the spring itself, which is a covered spring. And this complex is located right outside the village of Warm Springs along Route 220. Just a few interesting facts that might capture interest is we think that the very first building ever built on the site was around 1761, and it was an octagonal pool structure. And the records indicate that it held 40,000 gallons of water. And we're talking about water that is constantly being replenished. There are two springs that flow, one into the men's and one into the women's, and it maintains a constant temperature of 98 degrees. Many presidents, I shouldn't say many, several presidents have visited these bathhouses, as well as other famous people. I always chuckle, though, about Thomas Jefferson, who visited in 1818. He stayed for a while, arrived with some health issues, primarily rheumatism, that he wanted to have addressed, and he left feeling worse than when he arrived. And he wrote about it, and he had nothing positive to say. So the fact that later, more recently, in the last 20 years, the pools were referred to as the Jefferson pools is a bit ironic, because he had not a positive experience. But guests would come from long distances, and they would stay for extended periods of time. And that's because there was this common understanding that the minerals contained within this water was therapeutic, and that you needed to have a regimen of bathing over a period of time. One time wasn't sufficient, but if you stayed 3 weeks and went every day and also drank the water, some of your ailments could be addressed. So having set the stage about what the resource is and why it's important, I want to move to all the different players who were involved in saving the pools. And I'm not going to touch on all of them, just the principal players. And early on, there was an organization formed named the Friends of the Warm Springs Pools. And they morphed into what many of you may be familiar with now, the organization known as Preservation Bath. The Department of Historic Resources has been involved for a dozen years. We worked with the prior owner, KSL, and then once the property changed hands, we worked with the Omni Hotel Corporation. And assisting us was Preservation Virginia, which is the statewide advocacy organization, the statewide nonprofit. And so it really did take a village, and everybody had a different role to play. And I still marvel that everybody knew what that role was, and everybody stayed in their designated lane. Some of us played bad cop, some of us played good cop, and it all worked fairly seamlessly, which isn't always the case. So what was everybody upset about? If you hadn't been by the pools, you might not know how very deteriorated they had become. And I think it's interesting that there's this quote from someone who visited in 1828 who complained that they were in miserable condition. But that makes sense because we're talking about wood structures built over warm water. There's constant condensation, and the materials are going to deteriorate, which means you have to be in a mode of constant maintenance. And unfortunately, the ownership over the years were not committed to making that level of investment. And so the structures just continued to decline and get worse and worse. And I bathed in the pools under the conditions that you see in that slide on the right, where there was more daylight than roof. And I remember one time being in the water and a shingle falling and barely missing my head. So it was getting to a critical point, which is why finally the county decided that the bathhouses needed to be closed, and they actually did condemn them. So I'm going to just quickly run through the timeline of what has transpired, because I think it really sums up all the steps in the process. I reached out to the homestead when it was still under the ownership of KSL, and that was in 2010, and really got very little interest from them. Preservation Virginia stepped in and listed the complex on their 11 most endangered list in the same year. I then in 2012 reached out to corporate KSL and explained to them that they really had a public relations nightmare on their hands, whether they realized it or not. And it turned out they didn't. They had no idea. And at that time, there were all sorts of negative articles being written in the local paper, and there was a lot of social media traffic, and they were actually grateful because they didn't know. And that led to a negotiated agreement whereby KSL would actually give the pools to a local nonprofit. And we got pro bono legal assistance and accounting assistance, and we had drafted the agreement and it was ready for signature. And KSL took our advice and did a structural assessment to just sort of assess, what is the condition of the pools. And before the agreement could be signed, all of a sudden, the pools were swept up in an acquisition by Omni. And they acquired a number of properties in 2013, the homestead being one of them. They didn't seem to have necessarily wanted the homestead or the pools. There were other properties in the package that they wanted. So understandably, the pools were not their high priority. And they really didn't understand why they were important. So it took a while. Lots of meetings, lots of discussions. And then finally in 2015, they agreed to undertake a historic structures report. Unfortunately, none of the recommendations that had been in the structural assessment had been implemented. the pools were continuing to decline, even though we had really good recommendations for how to slow that down. And I advised them, when they agreed to do the historic structures report, to appoint an advisory committee of experts, because understandably, Omni doesn't have, in-house experts about preservation, historic buildings, and they agreed to do that. And so I served on that advisory committee, as did some of my peers, and we helped review the historic structures report, which is an encyclopedia history of the bathhouses. So it's really been an invaluable reference. Then 2 years after that, just to re-emphasize the importance of the pools, we updated the National and Virginia Landmarks Register nomination that greatly expanded on the historic context and narrative. Finally, in that same year, the historic structures report was completed, so it was available to be implemented. And then the county came along, understandably, in October and condemned the buildings and shut them down. There was a huge public reaction to that, because the pools are a real economic driver for Bath County. And a lot of the visitors to the bed and breakfasts and to the hotels wanted to go to the pools. And so there was a lot of negative publicity after the pools were condemned. And that really mobilized people. And the following year, there was a kickoff meeting with Omni to really get serious about talking about, what are you going to do? And they indicated that they were going to really do their due diligence and study whether to retain the pools at all. If so, whether to rehab them. They were even considering replacing them with entirely new structures. And so that took time for them to work through. And in 2018, Senator Deeds introduced a bill in the General Assembly that was also really important to this effort, because it implemented a transient occupancy tax that could help fund some of the work, both at the pools and the hotel. So we finally got Omni on board. And when I say Omni, I mean Omni Dallas, because that's where the decisions get made. And there was a wonderful press conference in February of 2020 announcing that they were making this commitment. And within 2 weeks, they were shutting down the hotel because of COVID. And they put the project on the back burner. And that was so deflating, because everybody who had been working on this thought it was really going to happen. It didn't. We kept chugging along. We dedicated a highway marker in 21 just to remind people how important this place was. And finally, last year in the spring of 22, Omni said, okay, we're ready. We're going to follow through on this commitment. They held another press conference, and they almost immediately got to work. Later in the year, I got the really good news that they had decided that they were going to restore the historic name. And that was really the cherry on top. So not only were they going to rehab the pools, but instead of calling them the Jefferson pools, which was just for marketing purposes and there was no historic basis for it, they went back to using the name of the Warm Springs pools. And then finally, just last month, there was the ribbon cutting ceremony and the pools reopened. So in the background of all those different things that happened, there was constant publicity. And the Friends of the Pools did things like rack cards, one of which is on the left. The local paper, the Recorder, was just diligent in covering this topic, as were other papers. The Richmond Times-Dispatch covered this. Friends of the Pools did these little bumper sticker decals. They did yard signs that were in people's yards. If you drove around Bath County, you could not avoid seeing something calling your attention to this crisis. And when I said that everybody had a different role to play, the publicity part was not mine. I needed to be behind the scenes working with Omni and not anger them or alienate them, but to build trust with them. And the preservation bath members could be more outspoken and do more of the publicity. And we complemented each other and it worked really well. So there were many challenges to overcome. And again, I think this is a great example of advocacy because these are not unique challenges to this particular situation. The change of ownership was really a blow because we had come to an agreement with one owner and we're ready to sign it. And all of a sudden we had a new owner and we were starting over again. I have worked with 4 different managing directors at Omni because, you know, people come and go. And every time someone leaves, in a certain sense, you're starting over again with them. Also, Omni had competing priorities, and I was always sympathetic to that because when they bought these buildings, both the bathhouses and the hotel, it was sort of a pig in a poke. They didn't really understand how much deferred maintenance there was, and there was a lot. So they had to focus on keeping the heat on and the lights on at the hotel. The bathhouses were not their priority. There was also the problem of them really not understanding what the big deal was. You know, why is everybody so upset and what makes these buildings so special? So we really had to educate them about that. And that's just the process that takes time. Then just getting down to the project itself and the logistics is the problem of just the complex hydrology of the site, because you have 2 springs and there's often flooding, and the buildings are very fragile, and that needed to be addressed. One of the things that really convinced Omni to move forward with rehab was my talking them through repeatedly use of the historic tax credits, and I'll speak more about that in a minute. But once I convinced them to use the tax credits, I had to convince the National Park Service that there was enough historic fabric here for the buildings to even qualify for the tax credits because they were so deteriorated. And by their very nature, had for decades had material replaced, and that's just the nature of these buildings. So there were lots of hurdles, and at one point I had a conversation with one of the managing directors, the person at the time, and he said, you know, they're just thinking about maybe taking the buildings down and building new. And so we had to start over again and kind of emphasizing why that's not a good idea and why these are really important buildings. So finally, they were all in. And there were some within the organization that questioned whether or not they shouldn't be updated. You know, should they have climate control? Should they have really nice restrooms? Should we put on an addition? You know, and finally, they came around to understanding and sharing the opinion that no, they need to be authentic. That's what attracts people to visit them, and they need to remain in their rustic state. And if you go there now and you visit them, they are not really much different than they were, except they're in good condition. So really critical to the success of this project was Omni's putting together of a really good team And I was worried about it because they didn't ask me for any recommendations. They just went off on their own and told me who they had decided to use. And they chose people who had never worked together before. And I thought, oh no, all right, well, let's hope this goes well. And fortunately, it went really, really well. The tax consultant, Sadler Whitehead, is one of the most prolific tax consultants in the state. They chose 3 North, which is a very, really, really capable architectural firm in Richmond. And then the contractor was Lionberger out of Roanoke. But, you know, we had that challenge too of stop start. We thought we were starting and then COVID came along. And by the time the project actually did get underway, the costs had soared. And I don't know, and I would love to get a quote from Omni. I don't know that they would have done this were it not for the federal and state tax credits. And we can all be really, really proud that Virginia has one of the very best state tax credit programs in the entire country. And what typically happens is that a developer, a property owner will use both the state and the federal in tandem. And in the gold box, you will see what this really means. Originally, the budget for the bathhouses was estimated at $2 million. And at the time, we thought that was more than any of us had hoped. And the cost ended up being double that. So with a state tax credit of 25%, whoops, sorry about that. You can see that the state credit would be $1 million and the federal credit would be $800,000. That's very motivating. So we're incredibly fortunate that in Virginia, we can offer that and entice private investment by these programs. And I do think it made the difference. Yeah, so moving on, once the project was about to get underway and they engaged their architect, there was a huge amount of study to be done. We had the structural report. We had the historic structures report, but those were now done a few years ago while the bathhouses continued to decline and deteriorated. So 3 North did a lot of intensive study and investigation, including digital cloud scans, and I'm just showing you one example of those here. They did a piece by piece inventory and produced sheets and sheets and sheets of detailed drawings. And this was important because we really had to determine how much historic fabric is there. There was so much replacement fabric. There was so much deteriorated fabric that even if historic couldn't be retained. We had to save every single piece that we possibly could. And we couldn't trust, you know, the work crew to be able to make that determination on the job site. They had to have a roadmap. And so I could show you more detailed drawings, but you wouldn't be able to decipher them. This is just an example of, you know, how they went member by member, determined its age, and figured out which pieces would be retained. And so a lot of upfront work before construction ever started. We also collectively agreed on what our mutual goals were for the project. And it was a short list. We weren't going to gussy up the building. It was going to basically stay in its rustic form. There weren't going to be a lot of guest amenities. We wanted to maintain the character but we needed it to be safe. And honestly, it hadn't been safe for a long time. And we wanted it to be accessible so that everybody could benefit from a visit. The other thing we know is that because of the damp climate and the wood structure, the building's always going to deteriorate. And we're always going to be having to change out wood members, keep things painted. And so the architect was committed to a very detailed record, providing a very detailed record of everything that was done now, so that years down the road, when someone else is faced with having to make decisions, they have the benefit of all this information. So that was a goal as well. And we agreed that given the amount of replacement material, we would do everything possible to save every piece of historic fabric. And then the harder part was to say, to decide, this is a building, these are buildings that have evolved over time. And I could show you, 50 different sketches of what changed when. But we had to pick a point in time that we were going to make decisions around. You have to have something that guides your decision making. And so we decided that we were going to use the date of 1925 as the period that we were going to make decisions around. And the reason for that is that all 4 of the standing structures were there then in their present condition. And that was a period for which we had the best documentation. So if you're thinking about, wow, this was an uphill battle, how come it actually all came to a successful conclusion? I just came up with this list of things that I thought made the difference. And I think having multiple stakeholders working in collaboration was probably the most important. Having people at the grassroots, people at the state level, people playing different roles. There was also the fact that the local businesses were really upset when the pools closed. They felt and they said that they lost business. And so that was, I think, a message that resonated with the Economic Development Authority and the county. I think that we all shared this mutual commitment to the pools being nationally significant. Nobody ever really, none of the people involved in this fight ever doubted that they were nationally significant. And then I think the publicity was really powerful, and I mean good and bad, because when one of the property owners, KSL or Omni, did something positive, they were rewarded in the press. And when they didn't, they were called out on it. And so publicity was really, I think, a powerful tool. And a lot of work up front, preliminary work, research, documentation, made it that much easier when work got underway. And I really credit Omni for keeping an open mind. They were not going to make a quick decision. They were not going to be pushed to make a decision that they weren't comfortable with, but they did keep an open mind. And I respect them for that. And in the end, they came around some of the community's, way of looking at this. I do think that had we not had the state tax credit, we might have had a different outcome. And of course, no project is successful unless you don't have the very best professionals involved on your team. Once the project started, I was so impressed by Omni's unfailing commitment to excellence. And that's reflected in the increased budget. You know, they hoped they would get in and out for 2 million, and it's twice that, but they didn't cut corners. And everybody was committed to the idea of authenticity. Let's not make this something that it never was. And then finally, everybody just had to be patient. I've never had to be so patient in my life. But everybody had a shared commitment to trying to achieve this outcome. So we finally did last month celebrate the reopening of the pools. And it was a wonderful day, and it's gotten a lot of press coverage, and Cardinal News did an in-depth article about it. And so now the bathhouses have been returned to their rightful place as a key driver of the local economy. And I feel like these buildings, more powerfully than really anything else could, will educate the public and tell the rich story about why Bath County is named Bath, why Warm Springs is named Warm Springs. And they will continue the legacy of therapeutic bathing that made Bath County famous for centuries. So good things come to those who wait. And now Omni is using the bathhouses as part of its promotional materials and advertising, which is exactly what we would hope that they would want to do. So I would love to answer questions if anyone has questions.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Did they, at the job site, did they need to divert the water temporarily to have a dry job site? Or how did they meet that challenge?
They had to drain the pools. And surprisingly to me, that doesn't really take very long. They can drain both pools in about a day. They can't completely drain them. There's just a little bit of water left. And so what they did is they built, they put a wood platform over top of that because there was still a couple inches of water and muck, but there are also rocks at the bottom. So they put a platform over that, but they drained almost all of the water out of both pools.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask?
Oh, yes, please.
Just any thought about the security, the future of the state continuing this kind of funding? You said the historic tax credits have made such a difference, and Virginia is just so rich in possibilities that I hope that's a commitment that continues.
Well, that's an excellent question to ask. We have had the tax credit since 1997, and there have been times that we have had to defend it. Not recently, thankfully. And I think that the reason that's so is that it's a program that really pays its own way in the increase in revenue to local governments because of increased property tax. And we periodically will do economic impact studies, and we're about to do one this year to make that case. So it's been 5 years since we last did it. We need to update those figures and then share them with the General Assembly. But I'm feeling pretty confident that we can hang on to it. And it is a feather in Virginia's cap, because I don't think there are many people who would disagree that it's the best state tax credit in the whole country.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I see a question about attendance. I haven't stayed up with it, but I know that the week that it opened, and I took the baths the very day of the ribbon cutting, that they were pretty well booked for the next week. And I haven't spoken to the manager since, but I do follow on Facebook, and I see a lot of chatter about people who have been there and people who intend to go.
Excellent, excellent. Diane Givens asks, can you speak to the difference between rehabilitation and restoration in projects like this? What's the definition of each?
So that is really an excellent question, and there is an important distinction within the preservation profession, and there are different standards for rehabilitation and for restoration. And the work that was undertaken at the bathhouses was definitely a rehabilitation. A restoration is returning something to a particular point in time, and that may involve removing something that came later. We didn't want to do that at the bathhouses. We wanted to keep everything that had evolved over time, the various additions and walkways and different things, porches. And so if we were to do a restoration, we would have had to tear those things off. We wanted to keep them. And so a rehabilitation is taking what exists now and repairing it, not taking it back to a particular point in time and maybe having to remove some of the things that have been added and were part of the natural evolution of the buildings. It may sound like an unimportant distinction, but it is pretty important because it guides your decision making.
Julie, I had a couple of questions. It's Betty. So first of all, I know the water continuously flows, but is there a certain process for cleaning, for keeping it clean? Because it's rocks, and of course they still would get like covered with, you know, moss or I guess and stuff. And the other thing is, how do you sit on the rocks when you go, and is it all uneven and so on? How do you do that? Because I want to go.
Yes, I want you to go. So yes, there are rocks on the bottom, but they're mostly smooth rocks, and they're kind of big rocks. But the pools they can regulate the level of the pools in both bathhouses, but they try to keep them at a level so that you might touch the rocks with your tippy toes, but you're not really standing on them because the water's too deep for that.
Okay.
And they provide those noodles, like styrofoam noodles, that a lot of people use, and you just kind of float around.
Oh.
And they do clean the pools by draining them and then, you know, kind of hosing them and washing them down. I don't know how often they do that. I've never been there when they've done it, but I do know that they do it. And that's possible because it really doesn't take that long to drain the water out of the pools.
Okay. Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you.
Goodness, we have a question from Michael in the chat. Can you speak to some of the rehab of the timbers? I think the Cardinal News article mentioned this.
Well, yes. I can't recall exactly which of the large timbers that were retained were of the earliest date, but we were surprised to find that some were. We were expecting that almost everything had been replaced over time, just given the wet atmosphere. And we were pleasantly surprised to find out that some of those really large, hefty timbers were very historic, and they were able to be retained. So that was a pleasant surprise. And then even some of the smaller wood members we were able to retain, but everything that could be was.
Michael Bentley asks, what is the source of the heat in the 98-degree water? Is it the depth?
No, it's not the depth. It's coming out of the earth at that temperature. The water is not that deep. in the pool itself. It's coming right up. You see it bubbling, and the bubbles come up to the surface, and the water is entering the pools at a constant 98 degrees. And if you've never taken them, I encourage you to do it. The waters may not have the same therapeutic benefits that people in the 18th and 19th century thought that they did, but your skin and hair will be very soft, and you will be very relaxed, and it's a great stress reducer. So that's got to be healthy.
Jim says he has some comments, and maybe Jim is typing. Don't have the comments yet.
I'm here. Can you hear me
Oh, there
okay?
you are. Okay, yes, perfect.
Okay, good. I was so interested in this presentation, and I want to thank Julie Langan so much for all her efforts on restoring the pools, or whatever the right word is for it, and putting them back into the condition that they used to be, rather than modernizing them in any way. I grew up in that valley, and we often went to those pools, and I enjoyed swimming there very much as a child, and have a lot of good remembrances of that. And we always enjoyed looking at all the carpentry when we were there. I remember a lot of the joints were made with wooden pegs, which dated way back in time and was particularly interesting. I remember I did see Tom Jefferson's letter on it, and Julie, you didn't mention the details, but he particularly did not enjoy the clientele. He didn't find anyone interesting to speak to over there, and he also developed a boil while he was there. And I don't think the water's caused the boil. I think that was an unfortunate circumstance, but it was kind of silly when the former owners tried to rename it the Jefferson Pools after his experience there. There was indeed a legend about the Native Americans using the pools. The runners going through would supposedly spend the night there and relax in those waters, and get up refreshed for a long journey the following day. Also like to speak briefly to the Warm Springs Inn, as it was when I was a child, right across the street where the folks stayed who took the pools, and the routiers operated that at that time. They had the most wonderful Sunday dinners there you could imagine, the best melt in your mouth roast beef dinners you could ever think of for a very modest price, and lots of the locals would come in there every Sunday. She had plates, a collection of plates over all the walls in there that was interesting to see. And yes, that water comes from deep underground in I think a geological formation they call a pluton or something like that, that came up from the mantle below, that supplies the heat to those springs and the other springs up and down the valley. For those of you that might be interested, I'd point out that there's a nice video on YouTube. If you Google Warm River Cave, the waters that go over the falls at the southern end of the valley all come out of one cave. And there are warm sources up in that cave. It's a very interesting and well done video, about 10 or 12 minutes. Thank you so much again for the presentation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for your reminiscences, Mr. Bowen. I have stayed at the Warm Springs Inn and have enjoyed, not during the time frame you were recalling, but recently I've had meals there, and the owner has made a real investment in that property and has put a lot of money into it and seems to be successful. And now that Omni has learned that tax credits really are an advantage to undertaking a rehab project. I think most of you are probably aware that they made the decision to move forward with using tax credits on the hotel, and that work is underway. And they have a budget right now of 120 million that they're investing there, and they hope to complete that work before the end of the year. So lots of good things have happened in Bath County recently.
Goodness, well, we have a couple more questions. A very practical one. How do you make reservations and what is the cost to take the
So
waters?
you go to the Omni website, and they do ask that you make reservations in advance. Right now, the pools are open Wednesday through Sunday, and I think they may expand that when the weather warms up. And the cost is $25, and that covers an hour soak.
Lovely. We've got a question. Let's see, from Catherine Wright. What are the timbers? What type of wood are the timbers that they would withstand the conditions of the temperature and the moisture over time?
You know, that is a good question for which I do not have an answer. I apologize for that. I do not know what wood they used for those timbers that have been so resilient. I think many of us know that old timber is much more able to stand the test of time. So for that reason alone, they're going to be more resilient than the new material. But I do not know what species of wood was used.
Yes. Well, that is everything that's in the chat right this minute. I don't know if anybody else has any questions. These are a lot of good questions on a very happy topic.
Very happy topic.
Goodness.
And
Well,
you
is there-
can go to and visit the pools, you know, even if it's the day that I was there last on December 15th, it was in the low 30s, and the water is very warm on a day that's in the low 30s. Now you do have the problem of getting out, and the temperature is the low 30s while you're drying off and getting dressed. But I don't think there's any place else in the entire country that you can go and have that kind of experience.
Well, thank you for everything that you've done to bring those back, and for generations are going to enjoy this. Goodness. I see a question from Carolyn. Carolyn has raised her hand. Is she waving? I don't know what this emoji is doing. Maybe Carolyn is just saying hello.
Oh, I see.
You have a question from, are the springs mineral water, and what minerals are in the water?
Great question. And I think that may be posted on the webpage for the pools that you can get to through the Homestead's website. I cannot recall what the composition of the water is. It's a long list. They have done a chemical analysis. They know exactly what minerals are in the water and in what proportion. And they do have a list posted when you visit that tells you that. I am a terrible chemist, so I cannot answer your question.
You have other skills.
Science was not my strength. I always gravitated towards history.
So we have a comment from Sue Ann Booth. I am so glad that the pools were saved. It was very interesting to hear how it came about. Thank you for all your efforts in this preservation project.
Thank you.
I think we would all echo that sentiment.
Well, I hope if there's any takeaway from tonight and what I've shared is that if you are in your own community facing a preservation challenge, you have to employ every tool available to you and as many stakeholders as possible. But if you do that, and if you are patient, you can have success. I mean, most of the time it feels like we're disappointed. because it's not easy to turn around someone's way of thinking, but be patient, don't give up, and you can have a good outcome.
As you very clearly have. In a big way, a big splashy way.